The 30th wedding anniversary party for my parents was held at the Riverside Country Club, the same venue where they'd celebrated every major family milestone for the past 3 decades. The elegant ballroom was filled with their closest friends, business associates and extended family members, all gathered to honor David and Margaret Hayes' 3 decades of marriage. I stood near the appetizer table, nursing a glass of wine and listening to the speeches about my parents' successful partnership in both marriage and business. Dad had built Hayes Construction into one of the largest commercial building companies in the state, while Mom had managed the family real estate investments that now included dozens of properties across 3 counties. 30 years of building dreams together, Uncle Richard was saying, raising his champagne glass toward my parents. David and Margaret have created not just a successful marriage, but a legacy that will benefit future generations. Everyone applauded. My parents beamed from their seats at the head table, surrounded by flowers and anniversary cards. My brother Michael stepped up to the microphone next. I want to thank everyone for celebrating with Mom and Dad tonight. They've set an incredible example of what hard work and dedication can accomplish. Michael looked polished and confident in his expensive suit. At 35, he was already a partner in Dad's construction company and lived in a mansion that showcased the family's success. Dad taught me that success isn't just about making money, Michael continued. It's about building something that lasts, something that provides for your family and your community. More applause. Dad nodded approvingly at his son's words. And now, Michael said, I'd like to ask our father to say a few words about the family legacy he and Mom have built. Dad stood up slowly, clearly enjoying the attention. At 62, he was still an imposing figure, tall, silver-haired, with the kind of presence that commanded respect in boardrooms and construction sites alike. Thank you all for being here tonight, Dad began, his voice carrying easily across the ballroom. Margaret and I are overwhelmed by your love and support. He looked around the room with obvious satisfaction. 30 years ago we started with nothing but a dream and a willingness to work hard. Tonight we can see the fruits of that labor everywhere we look. Dad gestured toward Michael. Our son Michael has embraced the family business and is already making his mark as one of the finest construction managers in the state. Michael smiled proudly as guests applauded. Michael represents everything we could have hoped for in a son, Dad continued. Ambition, intelligence, commitment to excellence. He's going to take Hayes Construction to heights Margaret and I never imagined. I took another sip of wine and checked my phone. 3 missed calls from my assistant, 2 text messages about tomorrow's committee meeting, and an email marked urgent from the planning department. Sunday evening was supposed to be my one night off from city business, but municipal governance never really stopped. Of course, Dad was saying, not every parent is blessed with children who embrace the family values of hard work and success. I looked up from my phone, sensing a shift in his tone. Margaret and I have been fortunate in many ways, Dad continued, but we've also learned that you can't force someone to want success. You can provide opportunities, but you can't make someone seize them. The room was getting quieter. Several guests were glancing in my direction. Our daughter Catherine has chosen a different path, Dad said, his voice taking on that particular tone he used when discussing my life choices. She works for the city. Administrative work. Nothing wrong with public service, of course, but it's not exactly what we'd hoped for. I felt the familiar knot forming in my stomach. Even at 33, I still felt like a teenager being lectured about my grades when Dad decided to air his disappointments about my career. Catherine is a good person, Dad continued, but she's never shown much ambition or drive for real success. She seems content with her little government job, even though it pays probably a quarter of what she could make in the private sector. Mom looked uncomfortable but didn't intervene. She rarely challenged Dad when he was holding court at social events. We keep hoping she'll wake up one day and realize she's wasting her potential, Dad said, warming to his theme. She's smart enough to do anything she wants, but she seems to lack the motivation to pursue anything meaningful. The criticism was delivered with Dad's usual blend of disappointment and condescension, wrapped in the language of parental concern. Our biggest disappointment, he announced to the entire room, his voice carrying over the clink of champagne glasses and the quiet murmur of conversation. Still working that dead-end job. The words hit me like a physical blow. A dead-end job. In front of 60 people including family, friends, business associates and my parents' social circle. I set down my wine glass and was about to excuse myself to the restroom when the ballroom doors opened. Suddenly the mayor walked in, looking slightly flustered and checking his watch. "Councilwoman Hayes. Ready for the city planning announcement." The entire party froze when they heard him address me by my official title. Mayor Patterson spotted me near the appetizer table and headed over with obvious relief. "Catherine, I'm so sorry to interrupt your parents' anniversary party, but the state just approved our downtown development proposal. The press conference is scheduled for tomorrow morning, and I wanted to make sure you had the final details." The silence in the ballroom was absolute. 60 people stared at Mayor Patterson, then at me, then back at Mayor Patterson. "Mayor Patterson," I said calmly, "this is my parents' anniversary celebration. Could we discuss this tomorrow?" Of course, he said quickly. "I just wanted to congratulate you personally on getting the zoning approvals pushed through. 24 months of work finally paying off." He turned to address the room, apparently just realizing he'd walked into a private party. "Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you realize what an honor it is to have Councilwoman Hayes in your community. She's the driving force behind the largest urban development project in our city's history." Dad was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Councilwoman?" Mayor Patterson looked confused by the question. "Of course. Catherine has been on the city council for 6 years. She's chair of the Planning and Development Committee and our liaison to the State Commerce Department." "Catherine is on the city council?" Mom's voice was barely above a whisper. "Not just on the council," Mayor Patterson said proudly. "She's being considered for deputy mayor next year. The governor specifically requested her input on the Regional Development Initiative." Michael found his voice first. "Catherine, you never mentioned being on the city council." Mayor Patterson looked genuinely puzzled. How could she not mention it? Catherine practically runs half the city government. She's at City Hall 60 hours a week. 60 hours a week? Dad repeated slowly. "Sometimes more during budget season," Mayor Patterson confirmed. "Catherine, didn't you tell your family about the infrastructure project? The one that's bringing 800 new jobs to the downtown district." I checked my phone again. "Mayor Patterson, perhaps we could continue this conversation tomorrow at the office?" Yes, of course," he said quickly. "But Catherine, the Journal wants to interview you about the economic impact projections. Are you available Tuesday afternoon?" "I'll check my calendar," I said diplomatically. Mayor Patterson turned back to the guests. "I really should let you get back to your celebration. But I hope you all know how lucky this city is to have Catherine Hayes working for us. She's accomplished more in 6 years than most politicians accomplish in their entire careers." He shook my hand formally. "Councilwoman, I'll see you at the 8 a.m. meeting tomorrow. And congratulations again on the state approval." After Mayor Patterson left, the ballroom remained silent for what felt like an eternity. 60 people continued staring at me like I'd just revealed I was secretly a superhero. Dad was the first to find his voice. "Catherine, what just happened?" "Mayor Patterson needed to discuss tomorrow's press conference," I said simply. "No," Dad said slowly. "I mean, what just happened with all that talk about city council and development projects and deputy mayor?" I looked around the room at the expectant faces. "I work for the city government, Dad. You know that." "But you said you work in administration," Mom protested. "I do work in administration. Municipal administration." Michael leaned forward. "Catherine, are you really on the city council?" "I've been on the city council for 6 years, I confirmed. "I was elected to my second term 2 years ago." "Elected?" Dad's voice cracked slightly. "You ran for office?" "Twice. I won both times." The silence stretched on while everyone processed this information. Uncle Richard cleared his throat. "Catherine, when you said you worked for the city, we thought you meant clerical work." "Why would you think that?" "Because you never talked about being a politician," Dad said. "You never mentioned campaigns or elections or council meetings." "I mentioned council meetings constantly," I said. "I just called them work meetings." Mom was staring at me with obvious confusion. "Sweetheart, why didn't you tell us you were an elected official?" It was a fair question and one I'd been asking myself for years. Because every time I tried to talk about my work, someone would change the subject or make comments about government jobs being dead-end positions with no real responsibility. The criticism was gentle but pointed and clearly hit home with several family members. When did you first run for city council? Michael asked. 6 years ago. Right after I finished my master's degree in public administration. You have a master's degree? Dad looked genuinely shocked. MBA in public administration from State University, I confirmed. I graduated summa cum laude. When? Mom demanded. 8 years ago. You came to the graduation ceremony. We thought that was just a bachelor's degree ceremony, Dad said weakly. No, that was my master's graduation. My bachelor's degree was from 4 years earlier. The family was looking at me like I was speaking a foreign language. Catherine, Michael said carefully, what exactly do you do on the city council? I chair the Planning and Development Committee, serve on the Budget Committee, and coordinate with state and federal agencies on economic development initiatives. What does that mean in practical terms? Uncle Richard asked. It means I oversee the approval process for all major construction and development projects in the city. I negotiate with businesses looking to relocate here. I manage relationships with state legislators and federal representatives. I help write municipal budgets and tax policy. Dad was processing this information with obvious difficulty. When you said you worked with construction permits, I oversee the entire permitting process for commercial and residential development, I said, including final approval authority for projects over $5 million. Final approval authority? Dad repeated. Within my committee's jurisdiction, yes. Michael was doing math in his head. Catherine, how many major projects do you approve per year? Last year we approved 43 commercial developments, 18 residential projects, and 6 major infrastructure improvements. What's the total value of those projects? Uncle Richard asked. I pulled out my phone and checked my notes from the last quarterly report. Approximately $340 million in new construction and development. The number hit the room like a thunderclap. 340 million? Dad's voice was barely audible. That's just last year, I said. Over my 6 years on council, we've approved over $1.8 billion in development projects. Mom made a small choking sound. Billion. The downtown revitalization project alone was worth $280 million, I explained. The new business district added another $150 million. The infrastructure improvements were about $90 million. Dad sat down heavily in his chair. Catherine, you're talking about more money than Hayes Construction has handled in 30 years of business. Different scale, same basic process, I said. Except instead of building individual projects, I help plan and approve entire districts. Michael was reading something on his phone. Catherine, I'm looking at the city website. It says you were named Municipal Leader of the Year by the State Association of City Councils. 2 years ago, yes. And you were featured in Government Executive magazine as one of the rising stars in local politics. That was last year. Dad was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Catherine, why didn't you tell us about these awards and recognition? I did tell you. You said it was nice, and then immediately started talking about Michael's latest construction contract. The truth of that statement was clearly uncomfortable for everyone. The mayor said you're being considered for deputy mayor, Mom said slowly. It's possible. The position opens up next year when Deputy Mayor Collins retires. What would that involve? Uncle Richard asked. Essentially serving as the mayor's chief of staff and stepping in for him when he's unavailable. Plus overseeing the day-to-day operations of city government. Michael was still reading on his phone. Catherine, this article says you negotiated the deal that brought Meridian Industries to the city. That created 400 new jobs. The Meridian deal took 8 months of negotiations, I confirmed. We had to coordinate tax incentives, zoning changes and infrastructure improvements to make it work. And you did all that yourself? Dad asked. I led the city's negotiating team. We worked with the State Commerce Department, the County Development Authority and federal representatives to put together the incentive package. Dad was shaking his head slowly. Catherine, I had no idea you were involved in anything that substantial. You never asked about the substantial parts of my work, I pointed out. You asked if I liked my job and whether the benefits were good. The criticism was delivered gently, but it clearly stung. But why didn't you just tell us directly? Mom asked. Why let us think you were doing clerical work? Because I wasn't doing clerical work. You assumed I was doing clerical work. Michael was reading more articles on his phone. Catherine, this says you're being mentioned as a potential candidate for state legislature. Some people have suggested it, I said modestly. Some people. Dad leaned forward. What people? The governor, for one. Senator Williams mentioned it at the Regional Development Conference last month. The governor knows who you are? Mom's voice was faint. I brief him quarterly on regional development initiatives. We've worked together on several federal grant applications. Uncle Richard was looking at me with new respect. Catherine, how often do you interact with state and federal officials? Weekly, usually. Sometimes daily during legislative session or when we're working on major initiatives. Dad was still processing everything. When you said you had to work late or travel for meetings. I was attending legislative hearings, meeting with federal representatives, or negotiating with businesses considering relocating to our city. And when you said you were too busy to attend family events sometimes? I was usually at city council meetings, public hearings, or official functions that I couldn't reschedule. The room fell quiet as family members began to understand the scope of responsibilities they'd been dismissing as a dead-end government job. Catherine, Dad said quietly, I owe you an apology. For what? For completely misunderstanding what you do for work. For assuming you lacked ambition. For calling your career a dead-end job in front of all these people. Dad, you were working with the information you had. But I should have asked for better information, he said. I should have taken more interest in your actual work instead of making assumptions. Mom reached across the table toward me. Sweetheart, we're so proud of what you've accomplished. And we're sorry we didn't understand it sooner. Michael was still reading articles on his phone. Catherine, this piece from last month says you're credited with bringing over 1,200 new jobs to the city during your time on council. That's the cumulative total from all the development projects we've approved, I said. And this one says the downtown revitalization project you led increased property values by an average of 35%. Economic development tends to have positive spillover effects, I confirmed. Dad was looking around the room at his guests, many of whom had listened to him dismiss my career just minutes earlier. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, standing up slowly, I need to make a correction to my earlier remarks. The room fell silent again. A few minutes ago, I made some very unfair comments about my daughter Catherine's career and ambitions. I spoke from ignorance and I was completely wrong. He looked directly at me. Catherine isn't our family disappointment. She's our family's greatest success story. She's accomplished more in 6 years of public service than I ever imagined possible. The applause that followed was genuine and sustained. Catherine, Dad continued, would you be willing to tell us more about your work? I think all of us would like to understand what we've been missing. For the next hour, I found myself answering questions about municipal governance, economic development, and regional planning. Family members who had never shown interest in my work were suddenly curious about everything from budget processes to zoning regulations. So when businesses want to expand or relocate, Uncle Richard said, they have to get approval from your committee? For major projects, yes. We evaluate the economic impact, infrastructure requirements, environmental considerations, and community benefits. And you have the authority to approve or reject these proposals? Michael asked. Within certain parameters, yes. Though we try to work with businesses to address any concerns rather than simply rejecting proposals. Dad was taking notes in a small notebook. Catherine, when you were negotiating with Meridian Industries, what was your role exactly? I led the city's negotiating team. We had to determine what incentives we could offer while still ensuring the deal benefited our residents and businesses. What kind of incentives? Mom asked. Tax abatements, infrastructure improvements, expedited permitting, workforce development programs. The goal is to create a package that attracts business investment while generating long-term economic benefits for the community. Michael looked impressed. That sounds like incredibly complex work. Can be. You're balancing competing interests and trying to create solutions that work for everyone involved. As the evening wound down, Dad approached me privately. Catherine, I need to ask you something personal. Of course. Are you happy with your work? I mean, setting aside everything I said earlier, do you find your career fulfilling? It was such a dad question and exactly what I needed to hear. I love what I do, I said honestly. I get to help shape the future of our community, work on projects that create jobs and opportunities for thousands of people, and be part of something bigger than myself. And the salary? I know government jobs don't always pay well. I smiled at that. Dad, I make $127,000 as a city councilwoman, plus benefits and a pension. If I become deputy mayor, the salary increases to $165,000. Dad's eyes widened. $127,000? Catherine, that's more than some of my project managers make. Public service at the senior level is compensated fairly, I said. Plus I have excellent health insurance, job security, and the opportunity to make a real difference in people's lives. I had no idea municipal positions paid that well. Most people don't. There's a perception that government work is low-paying and unimportant, but senior municipal positions often require advanced degrees and specialized expertise. Dad nodded slowly. Catherine, will you forgive a foolish old man for completely misunderstanding your career? Only if you'll forgive a stubborn daughter for not explaining it better, I said. We hugged, and for the first time in years I felt like my father actually saw me clearly. 3 months later I was appointed deputy mayor. Dad and Mom attended the swearing-in ceremony, beaming with pride as Mayor Patterson administered the oath of office. Today we're installing Catherine Hayes as our new deputy mayor, Mayor Patterson announced to the packed city council chambers. Catherine brings 6 years of exceptional service on the city council and a proven track record of economic development success. My family sat in the front row along with colleagues, constituents, and local business leaders. Dad had invited several of his construction industry friends, eager to introduce them to his daughter, the deputy mayor. In her time on city council, Mayor Patterson continued, Catherine has overseen the approval of over $1.8 billion in development projects, helped create more than 1,200 new jobs, and established our city as a model for sustainable economic growth. The applause was enthusiastic and sustained. After the ceremony, Dad introduced me to everyone as Deputy Mayor Catherine Hayes with obvious pride. He'd clearly done his homework, learning about municipal governance and economic development so he could speak knowledgeably about my work. Catherine engineered the deal that brought Meridian Industries to our city, he told one of his business associates. 400 new jobs and millions in economic impact. It was a complete reversal from the man who had called my career a dead-end job just months earlier. Sometimes the best anniversary gift isn't something you can wrap in pretty paper. Sometimes it's the gift of finally being seen and understood by the people who matter most. And sometimes the family disappointment turns out to be the family's greatest success story. They just needed the right perspective to see it clearly.